So here is our review video over development, looking at the economies within different countries, LDCs, NICs, and MDCs. We need to start off by talking about how do we talk about or measure development. And one of the most common tools used is the United Nations Human Development Index. Do take some time to look over this listings that are included in there. These are all important measures of different types of development. Right now, if you look at who kind of is the top in the world, I know I have 2013 data in this video, but Norway is still in the lead. United States actually continues to fall lower and lower in the development rankings, and our least developed country in the world is going to be Niger. This is a really interesting measurement that you can look at for determining how countries compare to each other in terms of development. There are three types of indicators of development: economic indicators, social indicators, and demographic indicators that will all tell you about various parts of a country's economy. The economic indicators probably are the most useful for this because they actually are going to tell you the strength of the economy as a whole. Probably one of the most important economic indicators of development is gross domestic product, which is the total value of goods and services a country produces in any given year. For comparison purposes, we want to look at GDP per capita, which means per person. So you take a country's GDP, you divide that by your population, and that's going to tell you about, on average, your GDP per capita, which is one way to think about what is kind of the average amount spent by a single person in a country in a year. The more money that individual people have to spend, the stronger the economy is. On average, MDCs have a GDP per capita of $27,000, while LDCs average around $4,000. Another economic indicator are the types of jobs. Remember, primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. The primary sector extracting raw materials from the earth. The secondary sector makes products, manufactures, constructs products, and the tertiary or the service sector sells products. Countries that are LDCs today have most of their jobs in the primary sector. Countries that are NICs have most of their jobs in the secondary sector, and countries that are MDCs have most of their jobs in the tertiary sector. The social indicators relate to health and education mostly. Countries that are more developed tend to educate their population more. So if you look at how long people stay in school in MDCs, people typically stay about 10 years in school. We're much higher than that in the United States, where our average, I think, is 14 years. In LDCs, 2 years is the average. And if you are a girl in an LDC, that number is significantly smaller, maybe half a year. Student-teacher ratio can be used to measure in the literacy rate, what percent of the population that can read or write is a very important measurement of development. In MDCs, about 98% of the population can read and write. That's slightly lower in the United States. In LDCs, it's going to be below 50 or 60%. And just to give some context, when we talk about literacy rate, we're typically speaking about reading and writing at what in the United States we would consider an 8th grade level. Health is another important aspect of social indicators of development. When you look at how much money a country spends on healthcare, the more they spend on healthcare, the more likely they are developed. The diet you find in countries is also important. In MDCs, people are typically getting 2,000 plus calories a day, while in LDCs, people average around 1,200 calories a day. And then the provision of public health care. When the government pays for your health care, all MDCs except one provide universal health care to their citizens. The United States is that exception, and it is the reason why we are falling down on the Human Development Index. You do not find LDCs that provide universal health care to their citizens. And then you have the demographic indicators. I'll give you time to pause this if you want and look over it at more detail, but you know all of these measurements from chapter 2, and this will just tell you kind of the difference between LDCs and MDCs. So then we talked about how LDCs could become MDCs. The first way they could do that is what's called the self-sufficiency model or the balanced growth model. And that is when the country kind of isolates itself from the rest of the world. And they're going to do that by setting up barriers to trade, limiting imports, putting tariffs on imports, putting a quota or a number restriction on them, as well as not exporting. Because when you export goods from your country, typically what happens is the value of your currency gets devalued a little bit right at the beginning, and LDCs want to avoid that. So they avoid exporting if they're using this self-sufficiency model. The big thing here with self-sufficiency or balanced growth is that there is equal investment throughout a country's economy in every sector, and limiting, kind of isolating from the rest of the world. On the other hand, before we get there, we have problems with self-sufficiency. First, it's inefficient. Self-sufficiency requires the government to intervene a lot into the economy by putting those tariffs and quotas on, and when they do that, they're going to stifle innovation and they're going to stifle growth. So we know that self-sufficiency can work, but it leads to slow levels of economic development. When India was using the balanced growth model for kind of developing their economy, they grew at a rate of about 3% per year. You also need a large bureaucracy, and that can be pretty expensive to manage all of those governmental controls. The other model of development that we looked at was Rothschild's model. This is also sometimes called the international trade model, and sometimes you'll even see it called like the neoliberal model of economic development. Remember, these are the 5 stages that a country is going to go through in order to grow their economy. The first stage is traditional society. That's at the very beginning before like any attempts of growing the economy occur. You're kind of thinking of like some of our early societies here. You're not going to find very many traditional societies left in the world. Then you have the preconditions for takeoff. That's the second stage of Rothschild's model. Here you have either an elite group of individuals or members of the government or even foreign businesses that decide, hey, something in this country worth investing in and innovate. And so they pick what that is going to be and start investing, in that technology and in that infrastructure. As opposed to the balanced growth model and Rothschild's model, the government only invests in one small part of the economy to help that one industry grow. That's going to lead to the takeoff. That's when that industry that the government invested in starts growing, and other industries will wait until that one to grow as well. This will lead to the fourth stage, the drive to maturity. This is when other companies start benefiting from that initial government investment in one company. So like imagine if the US government were to invest a lot of money in Rockwell Collins here in Cedar Rapids. If they were to do that, we would get some of the benefit from that because Rockwell Collins would start inventing new technology. They might bring some more other businesses to Cedar Rapids as their employee group expands. So we all in Cedar Rapids get the benefit of that investment, even though only Rockwell was the one to get that investment. Eventually, this leads to what's called the age of mass consumption, and this is when the economy starts focusing on consumer goods. This is when people can finally go out and like purchase their car and their 23 televisions. I even bet some of you might even live in a house that has more TVs than people or TVs than rooms in it. That's starting to become more and more common. And that's going to be when a country reaches the mass consumption. The 4 Asian dragons are your go-to example of countries that benefited through this international trade, because throughout these 5 stages, the country is trading with other countries, trying to specialize in their resources and kind of set production so it is evenly balanced between different countries. So your 4 Asian dragons actually didn't have any like real resources to invest in other than their labor force. And because they have a lot of people that were willing to work cheap, they're able to capitalize on that and grow their economies in textiles and technology. The Arabian states also grow their economy through international trade because they have a ton of oil that they sell to other countries. There are problems with the international trade model. First of all, there's an uneven resource distribution. For international trade model to work, your country has to have what's called a comparative advantage over other countries. That means there's at least one thing in that country that they can produce cheaper or better than any other country. Also, even if they have that, it might not be a very valuable resource. So it's important to make sure if you want to use international trade that you have a comparative advantage in a resource that you can get a lot of money out. It can lead to market stagnation, but the big one is it has increased dependence on MDCs. For an LDC to grow through this model of development, they have to trade with an MDC. And the MDC is the market for their good. And if they are lacking that market, they're screwed. Also, if the MDC can start kind of dictating what they want out of the product and start influencing the country in political ways that aren't always nice or appropriate. All right. One thing I did want to mention before we kind of move on to the end of development was with India, they used the self-sufficiency model and they were growing about 3 or 4% a year. In 1996, India switched to using the international trade model of development, and their economy started growing at about 7% a year. So the international trade model was about twice as effective for India in their economic growth. Remember, the United Nations has these Millennium Development Goals. I have the old ones listed here. They actually just came out, I think, 2 years ago with a new set. You don't need to like memorize them or anything, but just be like the general idea: eradicate poverty, make sure people can eat, have water, have access to healthcare. Just kind of those basic things that you would think the UN would want everyone to have. Sometimes development is tricky because of the social conditions in the country. If like you don't have a lot of drinking water in your country, no one's going to be worried about developing the economy. They're going to be worried about getting drinking water. And so there has to be kind of some base standards before development can really take off. Human trafficking is also a major problem in terms of the social conditions. Like, and human trafficking is like very, very terrible. I think it bothers me to even talk about it. And Iowa is kind of, in some sense, like the capital of human trafficking. No, I shouldn't say that, but like a lot of human trafficking happens in Iowa, a significant amount. If you've ever been to the I-80 truck stop, I guarantee you, while you were there were people being trafficked there at the same time as you were. That's how many humans are trafficked through Iowa at any given moment. Foreign debt can be another barrier to development. If you owe other countries money, it's hard to invest in your own country. Sometimes LDCs can be successful by borrowing money either from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. One problem that comes with that loan is that those loans are called structural adjustment loans, and they require the country to make significant changes to their government, to their economy, and to their infrastructure. So in some ways, it's almost like cultural imperialism. It's the World Bank saying, this is the way your government should be. And if you want money from us, you have to do it. Historically, these loans are not successful. In fact, they typically make things worse for citizens and LDCs if their government gets a loan from the World Bank or IMF because the government isn't using that money effectively. Political corruption or political instability also makes it hard for development just because you don't have like that leader there that can really spur the initiative. So there's some costs related to industrialization, related to economic development. Is cities or countries might have to build what are called export processing zones. And these are going to be special areas within a country that typically they change the law within these areas to allow for lower tariffs, lower or higher quotas, and fewer regulations to make it easier to get involved with international trade. This has led to like the establishment of maquiladoras in Mexico. Those are U.S.-owned factories in which the U.S. company owns the factory. It's produced in Mexico, but the good is sold back in the United States. Maquiladoras are not great places to work. They pay very low wages, even though they might be higher than other opportunities in the area, and lead to poor working conditions. We saw like this huge increase of maquiladoras when the North American Free Trade Agreement was passed in the mid-90s. And it has led to a proliferation of factories and EPZs in northern Mexico, right here, just along the border, because of how easy it is to trade with the United States. And there's just a little bit about NAFTA there. I know NAFTA is actually in the news like over the weekend and today, and probably will be for the next week or so because President Trump is trying to renegotiate it. Do not pay attention to that until after the AP exam, because let's say tomorrow President Trump withdrew us from NAFTA. there could still be questions on the AP exam about NAFTA and our role in it, and you have to assume we're still in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's just some information about NAFTA. It made trade easier between Canada, United States, and Mexico. But because of that, there have been growing tensions, especially between the U.S. and Mexico. Part of that is political. President Trump has certainly made it an issue about kind of the one-sidedness of NAFTA and how it seems to benefit Mexicans more than the U.S. That's not actually true if you kind of look at what NAFTA has been doing. But it has exacerbated kind of the tensions at the border with border security. So that in a nutshell is development. One last thing is tourism is a horrible strategy for LDCs to use to increase their level of development. Tourists can like bring people to LDCs, but what we have found is like tourists, in particular people that are especially going to like resort type destinations, when they encounter the native population, that tends to reinforce stereotypes of the native population and lead to even further kind of racial discrimination against them. Tourism might seem like a great idea for an LDC, especially like a tropical one where you can open a beach resort. However, you gotta have hotels there. You gotta have the resort itself. And I guarantee you, it's not the local population that owns that hotel. It is going to be a U.S. company, a transnational corporation. And so what seems like you're giving all this money to like a poor family in Costa Rica, you're actually giving money to the Marriott family in the United States. So tourism is not the greatest way for a country to grow its